Welcome. Some stories should never be told. Some books should never be opened. And some whispers should never be answered. Tonight, we dive into a tale pulled from the darkest corners of Reddit, a cursed book, a warning ignored, and a disappearance that defies reality. Turn off the lights. Put on your headphones. And whatever you do, if you hear a knock at your door, don't open it. The clock on Ethan's phone glowed a faint red, its numbers blinking 2:03 a.m. The dim light from the screen was the only source of illumination in the small, cluttered room. The air in his apartment was still, heavy with the silence of the night. He should have been asleep by now, but the rhythm of his thumb scrolling through the endless posts on r/no-sleep kept his mind active. He'd always been a fan of horror stories, especially the ones that blurred the lines between fiction and reality. After all, that's what made the stories on Reddit so enticing. There was always a sense of authenticity, like they could be happening to someone out there, right now. But tonight, something felt different. Ethan couldn't explain why, but the hairs on the back of his neck were standing up. He had been scrolling mindlessly through stories about haunted houses, disturbing encounters, and cursed objects when he saw it. The post. The title immediately caught his attention, "Do not buy this book, it will destroy you." He blinked, rubbing his eyes to make sure he wasn't imagining things. He'd read his fair share of dramatic posts on the subreddit, but this one stood out for its ominous tone. The user's profile was gone, the post marked as deleted, but the title remained. Ethan's curiosity gnawed at him. He clicked on the thread, unsure of what he would find. The comments were flooded with replies, most of them skeptical. One user, a self-proclaimed book lover named Bookworm69, dismissed it with a snort, "LOL, another one of those creepy marketing stunts. Come on, guys. It's just a gimmick." Another user, HorrorFan23, agreed, "It's probably just some lame publicity stunt. They probably want you to be scared so you'll buy it." Classic. But then, as he scrolled further down the page, something made him pause. A single comment stood out among the rest, not because of its length, but because of the eerie warning it conveyed. The user's name was Shadow Whisperer, and their response was simple, but chilling: "If you find the grimoire, do not read it aloud. It watches." The words lingered in Ethan's mind longer than they should have. He stared at the screen, trying to rationalize what he had just read. It was just another paranoid user, probably adding to the drama for attention. But something about it felt different. The way it was phrased. The sense of finality behind the warning. As if the user knew something Ethan didn't. He glanced over at his phone's clock again. 2:08 a.m. He had spent the past few minutes reading through the comments, and his curiosity was only growing stronger. With a few more taps, he found that Shadow Whisperer had posted a link in their comment, a broken link, marked with an ominous warning. It looked old, like a relic from the early days of the internet. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the link. It could be nothing. It could be just a dead URL, a part of the original post that was no longer active. But what if it led to something more? He couldn't resist the temptation to find out. He tapped the link. The screen flickered, loading a page that looked as though it had been untouched for years. The design was primitive, a mix of text and low-resolution images that screamed of early 2000s web design. The words at the top of the page were simple, yet unsettling. The Black Magic Grimoire, warning, this is not a book for the faint of heart. Ethan's stomach turned slightly. This was getting weird. The page seemed like something out of a forgotten corner of the internet, a place where the strange and forbidden resided. But even more strange was the fact that the site was still active. The URL was obscure, almost nonsensical. There was no way this was just some clever marketing scheme, right? He skimmed the rest of the page. The description of the grimoire was vague but filled with eerie language. It promised untold power and knowledge, but at a cost. The book itself was said to be bound in black leather, its pages covered in symbols that defied understanding. As Ethan read, a chill crept up his spine. The grimoire is more than a book. It is a living entity, and it has been waiting for you. His heart skipped a beat. The words felt too real, too dangerous. But as he continued to scroll, his gaze landed on the section that made his blood run cold. Do not read the book aloud. It listens. It watches. And once you open it, it will never let you go. A sense of dread washed over him. Was this a joke? Some kind of elaborate hoax to scare people into buying a book they didn't need? Or was there something more to it? Something real? He noticed the small, unassuming, "Buy Now" button at the bottom of the page, barely visible beneath the faded text. His finger hovered over it. He wasn't sure what drove him. Was it the thrill of the unknown, or the morbid curiosity that often came with late-night browsing? But in that moment, he decided to click it. The page refreshed, and the price of the grimoire appeared. $69.99. Not much for a rare, supposedly cursed book. Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The price wasn't even high enough to make him think twice. But the feeling of dread didn't subside. It lingered in his chest, gnawing at him. Before he could back out, he punched in his payment information, feeling a strange mix of excitement and anxiety. It was just a book. How bad could it be? A few days later, the whole thing would be a distant memory, just another late-night dive into the strange world of r/no sleep. Right? The next morning, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had woken up late, his phone still on the nightstand from the night before. As he stumbled into the kitchen to make coffee, his mind kept returning to the grimoire he had ordered. He should have been more cautious. There was something deeply unsettling about the entire situation, something that didn't sit right with him. He texted Mia, his best friend and the one person who would always tell him when he was being ridiculous. "You're not going to believe this, but I think I just bought a cursed book from the deep web. I swear to God, it's real." Mia, being the hardcore skeptic she was, immediately replied with a laughing emoji. "Yeah, sure. You're fine. I'm sure it's just some creepy gimmick. Whatever. I'll believe it when I see it." Ethan rolled his eyes. He had known she would laugh it off, but he had to tell someone. As he stared at his phone, a sudden ping interrupted his thoughts. A new email notification. "Your order has been confirmed." The Black Magic Grimoire is on its way. Ethan's stomach turned again. He tried to push it out of his mind, but it was impossible. The words from the Reddit comment echoed in his thoughts, "It watches." He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. Little did he know, that mistake was already beginning to unfold. Later that night, the doorbell rang. Ethan nearly jumped out of his skin. It was the package, just as he had ordered. The box was small, unmarked, and plain. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in dark cloth, was the Black Grimoire. His breath caught in his throat. The book was everything the website had promised: black leather, ancient-looking, with strange symbols etched into the cover. It was heavier than it should have been, almost as though it contained something more than just paper and ink. As he held it, a strange warmth emanated from the pages, as if the book were alive. Ethan couldn't help himself. He opened it. And as the first page turned, the room seemed to darken. The air grew thick, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye. The book was not just a book. It was a doorway. And Ethan had just stepped through it. A week had passed since Ethan had ordered the Black Magic Grimoire. He had tried to push the lingering unease from his mind, but every time he looked at the book, that unsettling sense of wrongness crept over him again. He hadn't read much beyond the first few pages, just enough to see the strange symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Enough to understand that this was no ordinary book. Still, part of him couldn't resist the temptation. After all, Mia had laughed it off, just as he expected. It was just a stupid book, right? He would be fine. Everyone would be fine. That was, until the package arrived. It was a regular morning when the doorbell rang, the sound of it jolting Ethan out of his trance. He was at the kitchen counter, staring at his coffee cup, lost in thought about the grimoire and the cryptic warning he had read on that forgotten Reddit thread. He wasn't expecting anything else. When he opened the door, there was no one there, only a plain, brown box sitting on the doorstep. There was no return address, no markings, nothing that indicated who had sent it or where it had come from. His heart skipped a beat. Ethan bent down and grabbed the box, bringing it inside. His fingers trembled as he carefully unwrapped it, his pulse quickening with every layer of tape and cardboard he peeled away. Finally, the package was open, revealing the contents. The book was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before. It was old, weathered, and bound in what looked like human skin, its surface slick and unnaturally smooth. The faint scent of decay wafted up from the pages, a mix of rot and something far more pungent. The title, once perhaps etched in bold letters, had faded almost entirely, leaving behind nothing but a barely discernible imprint. The edges of the book were frayed, as though it had been passed through countless hands over the years. Ethan's fingers hovered over it, but he hesitated. There was something disturbingly familiar about the texture, as though he had touched it before, though he knew that wasn't possible. His mind raced, and he almost convinced himself that it was just some elaborate prank. Maybe someone from the subreddit had sent it to him to mess with his head. But deep down, he knew better. He had ordered only the Black Magic Grimoire. This book was something else entirely. He carefully opened it, feeling the weight of each page as it turned. The words inside were written in a strange script, one that he couldn't make sense of at first. As he stared at the text, something strange happened. The words shifted. At first, it was subtle, like a trick of the light. But the longer he stared, the more it became apparent. The letters moved across the page, rearranging themselves into different words, forming cryptic sentences that seemed to change every time he blinked. Ethan felt his stomach churn. It has begun. He slammed the book shut. His mind was racing. This was no coincidence. This wasn't just some cursed object or elaborate prank. This was something far darker, something he couldn't begin to comprehend. The energy in the room felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, their edges twisting unnaturally in the dim light of the apartment. He felt trapped, as though the very space around him had started to close in. Just as he was about to open the book again, there was a knock at the door. Mia had arrived, just as Ethan was standing frozen by the table, the grimoire in his hands. She stepped inside with her usual, breezy attitude, but as soon as she crossed the threshold, her expression shifted. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive weight that seemed to settle into the corners of the room. The shadows that moved across the walls weren't just shadows, they felt wrong. She paused, glancing around at the darkened corners of Ethan's apartment, her brow furrowing. "Are you okay?" Mia asked, her voice suddenly laced with concern. She had never been one to indulge in anything paranormal, always dismissing such things as mere superstition. But now, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of unease that she could not ignore. Ethan chuckled nervously, trying to brush off the tension. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just weird vibes, you know. I was just about to try something from the book." Mia shot him a pointed look. "What do you mean, try something? You're not really thinking of going any further with this, are you?" He turned to face her, his voice tinged with excitement. "It's just a ritual, Mia. Like a simple summoning thing, nothing major. It's harmless. I've read up on it, this stuff is all over the place. People do it all the time." Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "You've read up on it? Really? Ethan, this is insane. That thing you found, it's dangerous. I can feel it." She gestured to the book still lying on the table. "The air in here is heavy. This place feels off. You have to stop." But Ethan, eager to prove he wasn't just imagining things, waved her off. "It's just a little ritual to see if the book works. No harm in trying it. It's all just nonsense, anyway, right? I'll be fine." Mia stepped forward, her voice low and serious. "No, Ethan. This is beyond what you think. You're playing with something you don't understand." Ethan dismissed her warning with a laugh, walking to the book and flipping through the pages. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Look, there's a simple incantation right here. Nothing too crazy." Mia stood by the door, her arms crossed, her expression hardening. She wasn't convinced, but she didn't want to push him further. Maybe, just maybe, this would blow over like all the other dumb things Ethan had gotten into. Maybe this was just another one of his phases. But deep down, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something had already changed. She watched as Ethan, ignoring her warning, placed his fingers on the book and muttered a few words aloud. The room seemed to vibrate in response, the air growing colder and colder with each syllable. Shadows twisted around the room like living things, creeping up the walls and stretching across the ceiling. "Stop!" Mia shouted, her heart pounding. But it was too late. The moment the words left Ethan's mouth, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the lights flickered. A deep, guttural noise echoed from somewhere far off in the apartment, vibrating through the walls. Ethan looked up at her, his face pale. "Mia. I think we've just made a mistake." The book had begun to pulse in his hands, its pages flipping violently, as if alive. And somewhere, far in the distance, something ancient and malevolent stirred. Ethan's voice trembled slightly as he began to recite the incantation. He knew he was taking a risk, and part of him felt a flicker of hesitation, but the other part, his curiosity, his hunger for answers, overpowered that doubt. He wasn't sure if it was the thrill of doing something forbidden, the promise of unlocking something dark and ancient, or just the strange allure of the grimoire itself. But he felt compelled to read the words aloud. The language was foreign, the syllables heavy on his tongue. They seemed to flow naturally from his lips, almost as if the book itself was guiding him. As he uttered the last word, the room fell silent. The stillness was unnerving. He looked at Mia, expecting to see her face twisted in disbelief, or maybe her hand already reaching for the door. But she was staring at the book, her eyes wide, her body frozen in place. For a moment, nothing happened. Ethan waited, holding his breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in on him. The flickering candle on the table cast long shadows across the room, but the shadows remained perfectly still, not even swaying with the gentle flicker of the flame. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, the candle flared violently. The flame shot up in a burst, nearly doubling in height, before shrinking back down, flickering like it was fighting against an invisible force. It made a high-pitched crackling sound, like the air itself was being torn apart. The room seemed to groan in protest, a low, resonant hum vibrating through the floor and walls. Ethan jumped back, heart pounding. But before he could say anything, the temperature in the room plummeted. It was like someone had thrown open a window in the dead of winter, letting in a gust of icy air. Mia gasped, pulling her arms close to her body as the chill crept into her bones. She rubbed her arms furiously, trying to generate heat, but nothing helped. The air around them felt wrong. It wasn't just cold. It was unnatural. "Did you feel that?" Ethan whispered, his breath visible as it formed a mist in the frozen air. He looked up at Mia, whose face had turned pale. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, her lips slightly trembling. He could see the fear creeping up in her, but a part of him, the part that had been drawn to this book from the beginning, didn't want to stop now. "Mia. Mia, look at the mirror," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. Mia turned toward the large mirror on the wall near the hallway. It was the only reflection in the room, a full-length mirror that had once been a centerpiece in the apartment. At first, she didn't notice anything strange. But then her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on the glass, her hand raised halfway to her mouth as she stared at Ethan. But in the mirror, Mia's reflection was motionless. No shift in her body language. No tiny adjustments of posture. It was as though the reflection had been frozen in time, a perfect, static image of her in that exact moment. The only thing moving in the mirror was the faint shimmer of the candlelight in the corner, casting an eerie glow on her reflection. "Mia," Ethan breathed, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Mia, move. Move your hand." She slowly lowered her hand from her mouth, glancing from the mirror to Ethan, then back to her frozen reflection. Her hand didn't move in the glass. "Okay, this is not funny anymore, Ethan," Mia said, her voice quivering. "Shut the damn book. Right now. We need to stop this." Her breath was coming faster now, her chest rising and falling erratically as the icy air tightened around them. Ethan could see the panic in her eyes, could feel the terror creeping into the room like a living thing. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch, as though they were watching, moving, waiting for something. "I'm going to shut it." "I will," Ethan said, his voice growing unsteady. But the truth was, he didn't want to. Not yet. Part of him was terrified, more terrified than he had ever been in his life. But the other part of him, the part that had felt the pull of the book from the moment it arrived, he wanted to know more. Suddenly, the air seemed to tighten even further, as if the room itself was closing in on them. The silence, thick and suffocating, was broken by a slow, deliberate sound. Knock. 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 3 heavy knocks, each one reverberating through the walls, the floor, and into the very marrow of Ethan's bones. The sound was slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was standing outside, waiting for them to answer. Mia froze, her eyes wide with terror. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. "Who the hell is that?" she whispered hoarsely, her voice trembling. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the door. The knocking had come from the direction of the entrance, 3 distinct, slow knocks that felt far too deliberate to be anyone casually passing by. But when he looked through the peephole, he saw nothing. There was no one standing there, no figure lurking in the hallway. "Maybe it's a prank," Ethan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But the knot in his stomach was tightening, and every instinct was screaming at him to not open the door. "You're kidding, right?" Mia's voice was sharp with panic now. "Ethan, that's not normal. That wasn't a prank. Someone's out there, and they want us to open that door." But despite her protests, Ethan stepped forward. It could be a delivery. Someone might have messed with the knock, just a weird coincidence. He hesitated for a moment, then reached for the door handle. But before he could turn it, the door rattled, as though someone on the other side was shaking it with force. Knock. 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 The sound was louder this time. More urgent. More alive. Ethan's heart began to pound as the fear set in. He couldn't explain it. This wasn't a simple knock. It wasn't some prank. It felt wrong. The presence behind the door wasn't human. It was something else. Something far darker. Mia grabbed Ethan's arm, her grip tight, her nails digging into his skin. "We have to leave. Now. This isn't just some joke. This is real. Ethan looked at her, his face pale. For the first time since the ritual began, he could see the true terror in her eyes. But the fear that had taken root in Mia's heart was only growing stronger in Ethan's chest as well. Despite everything, despite the fear, something deep inside him tugged him toward the door. Toward whatever was on the other side. I have to know, he whispered, barely audible. No. Mia snapped. Ethan, no. We can't, but before she could finish, the door swung open. And there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. No one. No sound. No sign of life. Only the oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on for miles. Ethan stood there, staring into the void of the hallway, the air thick with tension. And then, slowly, the door began to creak shut behind him. Mia grabbed his arm, dragging him back inside. We're leaving, Ethan. We are leaving now. But Ethan stood still, staring at the space where the door had just been. A thought lodged itself deep in his mind, cold and dark, gnawing at him. The book hadn't just opened a door to his apartment. It had opened something far worse. And whatever was on the other side, was now inside. The air felt thick and oppressive, like a heavy blanket had been thrown over the room. Ethan's heart raced as he closed the door behind him, trying to shake off the unease that clung to him. Mia was still standing by the window, her eyes darting nervously between the hallway and the room. She was visibly shaken, her body tense, like she was waiting for something to happen. And it wasn't just the door. It wasn't just the knocks or the cold air that still lingered, making the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand on end. It was the feeling of being watched. The sensation of invisible eyes on him, lurking in the shadows. The grimoire, resting on the table, felt like it was calling to him again, its presence undeniable. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of terror that had settled over him. This was insane. This was not real. But the knock, the cold, the mirror, it all felt so wrong. Ethan sat down at his desk, his hands trembling as he picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over the Reddit app. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what was happening to him. Why hadn't the warning stopped? He opened his messages and scrolled through his inbox. He saw several new notifications, all from the r/no-sleep thread. They were from users, some offering suggestions, others mocking him, dismissing his concerns as paranoia. But there was one message that stood out. It wasn't from anyone he recognized, nor was it even from a registered user. The username was just a long string of random letters and numbers. There was no profile picture, no history, just an empty account. The message read, "You need to stop. Now. Burn the book before it binds to you." Ethan froze. His fingers hovered over the screen, a chill creeping into his spine. The words on the screen seemed to burn into his vision, each letter an urgent command. Burn the book. His eyes flickered toward the grimoire on the table, its pages still slightly ajar, as though it were breathing, waiting for him to take the next step. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He tried to type a reply, desperate to understand who had sent the message. Desperate to ask why this was happening. His fingers fumbled over the keyboard, typing out, "Who are you? What is going on?" But before he could hit send, the message was gone. The screen blinked, the message disappearing as though it had never existed in the first place. The screen flashed once, then twice. Ethan stared, dumbfounded, as his phone suddenly flickered. The screen went black for a moment, and when it returned, it was glitching. The words began to form, slowly, like a sickness creeping into the fabric of the digital world. Too late. The message was crude, jagged, as if written by something far more primitive than a human. The words repeated, flickering across his screen, their presence growing darker with every second. Too late. Too late. Ethan jumped back, the phone slipping from his hands and crashing onto the desk. The room went pitch black for a split second before the lights above flickered, their bulbs buzzing angrily before returning to their dull, yellowish glow. A feeling of suffocating dread filled the room. Ethan's skin prickled with the realization that something far more malevolent was at work here, and it was coming for him. He grabbed the phone again, frantically trying to unlock it, but the screen was frozen. Mia was looking at him now, her face pale. Her phone had also gone completely black. "Mia." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "Something's wrong. Something's really wrong." She didn't respond immediately. She was staring at her phone in disbelief, then turned it over, pressing buttons with increasing panic. "My phone's not working. It won't even turn on." The screen remained blank, no matter how many times she tried to power it on. The power in the room flickered again, the lights dimming slightly before returning to their normal intensity. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow longer and more twisted, like they were creeping in toward them. Ethan felt it in his bones, the unmistakable presence of something not human. "Ethan, we need to get out of here," Mia said, her voice now trembling. She was backing away from the table, her hands pressed against her chest. This is not normal. This is real. We're being targeted, Ethan. We're being followed." Ethan could barely hear her over the rising noise in his ears, the sensation of something coming closer. Something watching them. His fingers brushed over the grimoire again, as though drawn to it despite the terror clawing at his insides. It was as if the book itself was alive, its presence in the room was suffocating, pressing down on him, pulling him in deeper. Mia's voice broke through his thoughts. "Ethan, the message said to burn the book, before it binds to you. What if it already has?" The words hit him like a cold, sinking weight. "Before it binds to you." His heart pounded, his breath shallow. What if I'm already too far gone? What if opening the book had already done something irreversible? The air grew heavier still. He could feel it, something thick, oppressive, filling the room with a weight that pressed on his chest. The lights flickered again, dimming to a ghostly pale hue, before they burst back to life with a harsh, almost violent flash. And then, the sound. A low growl. It was coming from the direction of the door. Ethan whipped his head around, eyes scanning the darkness beyond, but there was nothing. Only the silent, cold emptiness of the hallway. Another growl, closer this time. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the apartment. Suddenly, the door to the apartment slammed shut on its own, the force rattling the frame. The windows rattled with the sound of something scratching at the glass. Mia screamed. Ethan could barely move as the shadows on the walls twisted again, a dark, writhing mass growing and expanding as if coming to life. It felt as though the very space in the apartment was being consumed by something ancient and hungry. He reached out for the book. Too late. The words glitched again, filling the screen of his phone, flashing in his mind like a warning. And then, everything went black. Mia couldn't take it anymore. Her body trembled with terror as she stared at the grimoire resting on the table, the pages flicking open slightly as though inviting her in. The air in the apartment was thick, suffocating, and every minute that passed felt like an eternity, the shadows on the wall stretching out further and further, twisting like tendrils waiting to close in around them. The temperature dropped again, and Ethan's breath formed a mist in the air, clouding his vision. "Ethan, please," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. "We have to burn the book. We have to get rid of it. It's already too late, whatever this is, it's coming for us." She was shaking, her hands clasped tightly together as though holding on to the last fragments of her sanity. The knocking. The freezing cold. The whispering shadows. It all felt too real now. Too dangerous. And Ethan, standing there beside the table with the book in his hands, looked like a man possessed. He was no longer the person she knew, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a feverish intensity, and his body seemed distant, as though his soul was already slipping away. Mia stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the book, but Ethan pulled it away. His grip on it tightened, his knuckles turning white. "No," he said, his voice rough. "Not yet. I need to understand. I need to know what it's doing to us." She stared at him in disbelief. "Ethan, please, this is madness. You don't understand. We can't control this. We're not even here anymore. This, whatever we're dealing with, it's already inside us." Ethan's eyes flickered toward the book, his hands gently running over the ancient, rotting leather cover. He was trembling now, but there was something else in his eyes, something dark, something that Mia hadn't seen before. She knew it. She knew that he was no longer in control. The book had taken hold of him in a way that neither of them could comprehend. "I'm going to post one last time," he muttered, his voice cold, distant. "I have to. Maybe someone out there can help us." Mia shook her head violently. "No, Ethan. No more posts. No more experimenting. Please. It's only making it worse." But Ethan was already unlocking his phone, his fingers moving mechanically as he opened the Reddit app. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for just a moment. His mind was clouded, fogged by the terrifying grip of the grimoire, but in the back of his head, a part of him knew that this was his last chance, his last attempt to reach out. To do something, anything, before it was too late. Finally, he typed his post. His fingers moved as though they had a mind of their own, the words spilling onto the screen like some kind of final plea. "I need help. Something's happening to me. To us. This book, it's changing everything. It's watching us. Please, if anyone can help, if anyone knows how to stop this, I'm begging you." He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the post button. The room went dead silent. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she looked at Ethan. Nothing. For a moment, she thought maybe it had worked. Maybe, just maybe, something was going to change. But then the temperature in the room plunged to near freezing again, and the lights flickered, this time, violently. The sound of the flickering lights grew loud, like an electrical surge, and the shadows twisted unnaturally on the walls. Ethan's phone screen glitched, the text distorting into incomprehensible shapes, the words warping and bending like the screen was fighting against reality itself. His hands trembled as he tried to make sense of it. The room seemed to warp around him, the edges of his vision pulling in like the space itself was collapsing. And then, through the distortion, a whisper cut through the silence. It was soft at first, a breeze, like the voice of something close, too close. "You invited me." The words echoed in Ethan's mind, reverberating in his skull like a deep, cold pulse. His body stiffened as the blood drained from his face. His fingers, now trembling uncontrollably, dropped the phone onto the desk. The screen blinked once. Twice. Then went black. Ethan looked up, his expression a mixture of horror and awe. It's real," he murmured, barely able to speak. Mia stepped back, her hands flying to her mouth. Her body was frozen with fear, unable to comprehend what she was witnessing. The room was alive now, alive with something that didn't belong. The shadows twisted, moving in ways they shouldn't, and the temperature plummeted further until the air felt like it was suffocating her. "No," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "Ethan, no." Before she could react, the air seemed to shimmer, to distort, and then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The lights returned to normal. The room fell silent. But Ethan was gone. The phone was on the desk, its screen flashing with the last words Ethan had typed, "It's watching me." Mia rushed toward him, her heart pounding, but the space in front of the desk was empty. She spun around the apartment, calling his name, her voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer. No sign of Ethan, nothing to explain where he had gone, nothing to suggest that he had just walked out. She checked the door. It was unlocked. The apartment was still and silent. Ethan had vanished. Mia's stomach dropped as the realization hit her. He was gone. She turned back toward the desk, the empty space where Ethan had been standing just moments before. She stumbled back as something strange caught her eye, the grimoire, resting open on the table, its pages now blank. Ethan's Reddit account was gone, erased from the platform entirely. His username no longer existed, like it had been wiped from existence. She couldn't understand. She couldn't breathe. Minutes passed, perhaps hours. Before Mia, broken and trembling, slowly walked out of the apartment, her mind a blur of terror. She had to get out. She had to leave. This place was no longer safe. But when she reached the door, something stopped her. There, lying on the doorstep, was a package. Her heart skipped a beat as she bent down to pick it up, her fingers shaking. The package was wrapped in brown paper, old and brittle. No return address. No name. She stared at it for a long moment, the air around her growing colder with each passing second. She ripped open the package, her hands trembling. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, the same one. The same ancient grimoire that had brought all of this upon them. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the cover, the same dark, unsettling symbols etched into the rotting leather. But it wasn't the book that made her scream. It was the message attached to it. You invited me. The whisper echoed in her ears, and suddenly, Mia understood. She understood that the game wasn't over. Not yet. The book was here. And it was waiting for her.